morning, class. I hope that you're all doing well today. It's time for us to get started, and once again we're going to look at Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. Now remember yesterday we had our first reading of the poem, and we also went over difficult vocabulary words and also looked at the allusions found in the poem, and that helped us understand the poem just a little bit better. After that, remember we watched the version of The Simpsons' The Raven, and then after we finished watching that, we compared and contrasted the two different versions. Now today, we are going to be looking at the structure of the poem. We're going to be looking at the literary devices that Poe used in his poem to create a musical effect, and we're also going to be talking about author's craft, why he made the decisions about what he would include in his poem before he even began writing. I'm going to be taking you through a close reading activity of the poem. We're going to be analyzing it, taking it stanza by stanza, line by line. I'll be modeling for you how to do that, and I'll be using a think aloud activity so you can kind of see what I'm thinking as I'm going through the process. After that, I'm going to be turning the work over to you. I'm going to let you work with a partner, and I'm going to be assigning you a specific stanza to work on, and then I'll give you some time to do that, and then at the end of class, I will bring us back together, and we'll have the whole group, and we will discuss our findings, what we found out. And finally, at the very end of class, I will be assigning you a homework assignment. It's going to be a reflection activity for you. You're going to be able to think about a time in your life when you experienced grief. Maybe when a loved one died, a grandparent, or maybe a pet died. You can just think about it and discuss how you dealt with that grief, that sadness in your life, how you got through it. Okay, today you're going to be learning how to identify literary devices in Poe's The Raven. So let's go ahead and get started. Poe was called America's first great lyric poet. Although he wrote short stories and magazine articles, he always felt like his true calling was to be a poet. He described poetry as the rhythmical creation of beauty, and he thought that the sound of poetry should do as much as the words used to convey the meaning of the poem. Poe wrote The Raven in 1845. It was his most famous work, and he was often called upon to recite it in public. And it was said that when he would recite the poem, that he would almost sing the lines to the audience. Nothing was accidental about Poe's poems. Every element of the poem was very, very well thought out and greatly considered before writing even began. And it's possible that financial considerations came into this thinking before he wrote. Remember, we talked about how Poe had a very sad life. When he was a young child, his parents died. He was orphaned at the age of 3. He was eventually taken in by adopted parents, the Allens of Richmond, Virginia, but eventually they rejected him. He was accepted to West Point Academy and began attending, but was unable to stay because his father, his adoptive father, Mr. Allen, refused to send him enough money to survive up there. And then also his very young wife, Virginia, contracted tuberculosis at a very young age. This was a common illness at the time, and it was a disease that affected the lungs and breathing. And once someone had tuberculosis, there was no cure. It took a long time, but eventually they would die. So he faced many of these sadnesses, and also Poe was really penniless during his life. He was one of the first writers to try to make a living as a writer. And of course, this is really difficult to do. By writing the short stories he did and the poems, he wasn't able to make enough money to live. He wasn't able to pay the bills. So when he was considering what he was going to use when writing The Raven, he was trying to come up with popular themes and ideas, things that would really appeal to people. He wanted it to be a successful poem, and he wanted to make some money. He wanted to be able to pay the bills. So we know what Poe's intentions were when writing the poem because he wrote an essay about it called The Philosophy of Composition. First of all, he knew that he would be creating a melancholy mood in the poem. And after thinking about it for a while, he considered that the long O sound sounded very sad. So he used that. Remember, nevermore, the O sound. Poe also decided that the saddest topic to use for the poem would be about the death of a beautiful young woman. And he decided that the narrator would be the woman's lover, and he would show how that narrator experienced devastation and loss at her death. Now, before we look at the poem and begin breaking it down, let's review some of the literary devices we're going to be looking for in the poem. First of all, remember alliteration. Alliteration is using the same consonant sounds. They're repeated consonant sounds in the same line of poetry. An example of that is, while I nodded, nearly napping. You hear the N sound being repeated there. That's alliteration. The next is astness. Astness is when you have repeated vowel sounds in a line of poetry. An example of that from The Raven is, terrors never felt before. That error sound is repeated. Next, we have internal rhyme. Internal rhyme is when two words rhyme within the same line of poetry. Internal rhyme. An example of that is dreary and weary. Next, we have an onomatopoeia. An onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like the literal sound that it makes. An example of that in the poem is tapping. When we say the word tapping, it sounds like tapping, the sound that it makes when you tap on the board. Next, we have a refrain. Poe used a word or phrase repeated at the end of each stanza. And of course, remember what it was. At the end of each stanza, he would have the raven saying, nevermore. He also used repetition for effect in the poem. An example of this is tapping at my chamber door. And he also used rhythm, the audible pattern created by alternating accented and unaccented syllables. So let's go ahead and take this down. Now that we've reviewed our literary devices, we're going to take a close look at the poem and look for the literary devices. Okay, I have my colored markers. We're going to be coloring the different literary devices, different colors. So let's look at the first stanza of the poem. Remember, a stanza is a group of lines in a poem. And in The Raven, the stanzas are composed of 6 lines each. So let's look at The Raven. First stanza, let's take it line by line. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary. Okay, so it looks like weak and weary both start with a W. So that's a repeated consonant sound. So that's alliteration. Weak. Use another color. Weak and weary. Also, in the first line of the poem, we have dreary and weary, and those rhyme. So those are examples of internal rhyme. Next line. Over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. I don't think we see any in that one. Next line. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping. So we have another example of alliteration. While I nodded, nearly napping. And we also have some more internal rhyme. Napping and tapping rhyme. So we have another example of internal rhyme. As of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. Well, look, he uses rapping twice here. So here's an example of where he uses repetition to create effect in the poem. So let's go ahead and mark that. We're going to put an R for repetition. 'Tis some visitor, I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this and nothing more. Okay, let's go down now to the second stanza. Ah, distinctly I remember, it was in the bleak December. Okay, looks like we have internal rhyme again. We have remember, December. Internal rhyme. And each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Okay, nothing in that one. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow. We have two more rhyming words. They are morrow and borrow. So we've got more internal rhyme. You can tell that internal rhyme is found throughout this poem. And it contributes to the musical effect of the poem. Okay, the next line. From my books, surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore. So, surcease and sorrow, we have two S's used, so that's alliteration. Surcease of sorrow. And then another one, sorrow for the lost Lenore. That's three S sounds, that's alliteration. And look at the lost Lenore. This, who do you think this might be symbolic of? Maybe someone that Poe lost in his own life, a female figure. So the lost Lenore in the poem is symbolic for the loss that Poe has experienced. For the rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. In this one, we have some repeated vowel sounds. Rare and radiant maiden. So when we have repeated vowel sounds, it's assonance. So let's give that one another color. Rare and radiant maiden, whom the angels named Lenore. Nameless here forevermore. Okay, let's work together on the third stanza. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain. What do you guys think? What do you recognize in that line of poetry? Okay, good. We have some alliteration. Silken, sad, uncertain, rustling. Silken, sad, uncertain, rustling of each purple curtain. Okay, do we have any repeated vowel sounds in the poem? Okay. Yeah, we do. So let me see. Purple. We have the vowel sounds in purple and curtain. Very good. Okay, next line. Thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before. Okay, what do you guys think? Okay, you think there's some more repeated vowel sounds? Okay, that's right. Good. Thrilled me, filled me. We have some similar vowel sounds there, repeated vowel sounds. So that is assonance. Thrilled me, filled me. Okay, next line. So that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating. Okay, I don't see anything there. Next line. 'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. You see anything there? Okay, I don't see any literary devices there. Next line. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. Okay, what do we have right there? Good, we have repetition, so let's put an R next to it. Repetition. Right here. Here's an example of Poe using repetition for effect in the poem. And finally, this is it and nothing more. Okay, what do we have here? Okay, very good. No, the long O sound is not a literary device, but it is something Poe uses in the poem to create a sad sound. Very good. So it's not a literary device, but it's a tool that Poe uses. Okay, now I am going to let you all work with a partner. And I'm going to be assigning specific stanzas to you to work on. So while you all are working on that, I will be circling the room to see if anybody has any questions or doesn't understand something. So let's go ahead and get started on that. I will be circling the room. Let me know if you have any questions.